Thank you so much for joining today's session on evaluating productivity in the pandemic era. I'm Dr. Christine Kelly, the Associate Director of PHutures at Johns Hopkins University. And today we're really delighted to be joined by Dr. Katy Peplin, the founder of the coaching practice and global community Thrive Ph.D, who will be facilitating today's workshop. Thanks so much, Dr. Peplin, and welcome. We're looking forward to today's session. As thoughts and questions emerge throughout the workshop, please do feel free to drop them into the chat. Thanks again, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Peplin.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here, so honored to be included. So let's get into it. So this is reevaluating productivity in the pandemic era. So let me just make sure that my slides are working. Some aims for today, some workshop aims. Let's explore the problem of productivity in the pandemic era and maybe its historical roots and current manifestations and wrinkles. We'll think through an experimental system for redefinition of productivity and how we measure it and how we evaluate it. And then 3, where we'll be spending the bulk of our time today, strategies that you could start today or in the new year, LOL, to support your experiments. Just to quickly kind of run through our agenda, we've got why does productivity feel so weighty and complicated right now? Experimental theory and design. I found a typo already that should say data doesn't lie, but we'll talk about how your data doesn't lie. Strategies for work and evaluation, and that it is my hope to have a fair bit of chunk of time at the end for questions and answers and sort of community brainstorming. So with that being said, who am I and why am I leading this? Great question. My name is Dr. Katy Peplin. I use she, her pronouns, and I am learning this through doing it right here with you. I was already working from home full time when the pandemic hit, and this still was a huge adjustment for me. I wasn't used to sharing my workspace with my husband, who may or may not be listening on the other side of the door. I wasn't used to not being able to use all of my various trips and tools like working out outside of my house and going to libraries, all of that kind of stuff. But the rest of my credentials outside of just being in the struggle bus here with you is that I got my PhD in 2016, and shortly thereafter I started a coaching practice where I was full-time remote. It's a business that I run out of my home. And I specialize in working with neurodiverse clients, non-traditional students, and people who want to be humans and scholars at the same time. But part of my credentials for this also are the fact that I have a chronic illness. That means that my productivity, to put it mildly, ebbs and wanes with my pain levels. And I also have a brain that likes to do some sort of silly things. Sometimes I call it brain shenanigans, brain weather. My therapist would call it an anxiety disorder with a little bit of depression thrown in, but it's definitely something that I am working with myself. So everything that I'm sharing in this workshop is both my own lived experience and then the experience of my clients around the world and the fair bit of professional development that I've done, because this is a tricky thing. If it were really simple, we all would have figured it out already. We're smart people, either getting our PhDs, about to get our PhDs. So if this was an easy nut to crack, we would have already done it. So if you're coming to this workshop feeling guilt and shame about not being productive, about not being as productive as you could be, welcome. I am also not as productive as I could be. So let's learn together. Okay, so as I was making these slides and doing a fair bit of kind of thinking and moving through what I wanted to say, my first question was, is staying alive for the past 20 years, or with the added complications of keeping your family safe and healthy, your kids safe and healthy, your extended community safe and healthy, was that not production enough? But that the roots of the question, what we produce, when, in what conditions, they were always complicated. And the pandemic definitely definitely heightened inequities. It heightened the differences between who can access what resources. But this was already difficult before we were in the middle of the pandemic. So like at the very minimum, staying alive for the last 18 months, 20 months is a huge accomplishment. Getting anything done in the midst of a pandemic is a huge accomplishment. But as we move from sort of acute crisis into long-term working rhythm that may or may not change in the foreseeable future, we do have to sort of evaluate the differences between, these are my crisis responses. This is how I'm working when I've been like flung from the warm nest of my office on campus into my living room or my dining room or my bed or my shared house, into how do I make this work if it's going to be a longer term situation. So overall, the resources available to us to aid in our productivity have changed. We are not able to access some of the same resources. I know that I personally, if I were given a safe coffee shop that I could be in during the day and not have to wear a mask and be able to take clients and to meet people and see friends, my productivity life would be completely different. I just don't have that resource available to me right now. Maybe your resources of alone time, or time without your students, or time without your kids, or time without your cats trying to get in. I have 4 cats and they have all been locked out of this office because they, the resource of cat-free time has also changed for me. But also the expectations have really changed as well. So when we think about what it means to be productive, we have to acknowledge that productivity is a cultural narrative, and that overall, as a global community, we're figuring out what it means to be productive, but also specifically as academics and those of us who I like to term as like para-academics or academic adjacent or people who are scholars, we also have the microcultural narrative that's been going on. You only have to look at academic Twitter to see the sort of 2 sides of the same coin. The people who are bragging and saying, you know, it feels like a brag to me. I could only do 15, I could only do 15 focused hours of work today. I'm so off my game. And then the other people who are like, yes, I managed to respond to 2 emails, having locked myself into my bathroom to avoid my children who are also at home full time. So the narrative around what it means to be productive as an academic right now has definitely changed. And also we have personal expectations about what we can do, what we should be able to do, what we feel like other people are doing. And all of that has gotten more sticky, more weighted, more complicated. Okay. 40 hours a week also isn't what it used to be. So I have included in the chat on the Whova app a whole list of books that you can read about the historical precedent of labor. And I do not have time to give a fully throated presentation, although I wish that I could. It wouldn't be the most useful for you anyway, about what the 40-hour-a-week expectation is, how we came to it, how it was sold to us as a cultural narrative. But to put it very succinctly, it isn't what it used to be. The 40-hour-a-week work week was codified much longer than people, or much later than people felt like it was. It's not something that's been around for time in memoriam. It was a specific historical development. And also the 40 hours a week assumed that you had support full-time at home, that 40 hours plus leisure time didn't include any of the labor of managing a home, whether that is childcare, keeping your house somewhat clean, somewhat organized, preparing meals, going outside of the home, taking care of elders, doing any sort of spiritual practice, having any sort of community management. A lot of these 40-hour-a-week expectations were based on the idea that one person was working outside of the home and that there was a second full-time person available to do everything else. So a lot of us start with a baseline of, okay, I'm going to work 40 hours a week, but if 40 hours a week is now also in a world where you're expected to have a side gig, or you're expected to have professional development, or the boundaries of that work and what is or isn't clocked, it might not still apply. So I definitely recommend the book Work Won't Love You Back as a deep, full-throated historical analysis of this. But basically, long story short, 40 hours a week was a little bit made up anyway, and it's very made up now. So specifically for academics, though, credential creep is really real. There probably is someone who's working right now. And that's a reality that a lot of us have to confront. If one of the big problems from working from home is being the monitor of your own boundaries, it's really hard to know that there is probably someone somewhere else in the world who's working, and that they are working 15 hours a day. They may or may not be talking about it on Twitter. They may or may not be in your department. But we have a lot of people who are responding to the overall problem of PhD credential creep, where we're expected to not only have publications, but multiple publications. I know in my field, when I started as a PhD student, it was normal. It was considered a bonus to have a publication in a journal that was under review when you were on the job market. And now, just about 7-8 years later, it's normal to have a manuscript underneath review, and multiple peer-reviewed publications on your CV. So some people are getting around that credential creep by brute force. They're just working more. They're collaborating more. They're working their teaching job. They're getting their dissertation done. They're also collaborating. They have a side gig. They have a podcast. There's some people who are doing it just through brute force, more time. But the credential creep is also absolutely highlighting the systemic injustice of this, and the inequity. You may not have time to brute force, and you're competing against somebody who maybe has an academic parent who can walk them through the systems of the job market. Maybe they have a full-time partner who lives at home and handles all of the household responsibilities. Maybe they have the privilege to be able to take a semester off and focus fully on an internship. But there is a reason that this doesn't feel fair. And the reason is because it isn't fair. A lot of what you are available to produce is constrained by or enabled by your relative privilege. And if you aren't privileged in certain areas, if you don't hold certain resources, if you don't hold certain systems or positions of power, you are going to not be able to produce as much. That's just the fact. It's unfair, it's inequitable, but it needs to be acknowledged. We're not all working with the same set of resources. But okay, now that I've done the very sad labor under post-capitalism, little bit of preface, there are some things that you can do. And I am going to pitch this idea of experimental design as the most useful tool to both define what you want to improve, figure out strategies that will work for you to move in the way that you want to, and then to keep iterating in that. So different parameters need different solutions. The way that you would have helped yourself achieve a level of productivity that felt good and satisfying in 2019 isn't the same set of parameters that you're working with now, and you probably need different solutions. And that's not a problem with you. It's not a problem. It's an experiment that needs to be run. So when I work with clients and they come to me and they say, Katy, I can't focus, I'm not productive, we often really have to drill down and say, okay, what does that mean? How do you know what works for you? And how do you know what conditions are right for which tools? Because the conditions that you might use time blocking for could be completely different than the conditions that you're in right now. When you were at your most productive in, say, coursework, has completely different parameters for than what you are now that you're ABD, and so on and so on. So the 3-step system that I use for almost everything is to think about this in terms of having a hypothesis, For example, you could hypothesize that having a hard cutoff time at 8 p.m., no matter what, would improve your ability to wind down and get better sleep. So that's your hypothesis. You may or may not know if it's true. Then you say like, okay, let's design an experiment. For the next 2 weeks, no matter what, I'm going to stop at 8 o'clock and I'm going to also collect some data. How did I sleep? I'll look at my Fitbit. I'll see if it was easier for me to wind down. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, you get to decide, did this experiment work? Yes or no? What can I learn from the data? Do I want to have a new hypothesis or do I want to keep working with this strategy? The frustrating part, and something that we can talk about a little bit later, is that I wish if I could wave a magic wand and make this a straight line where you had a hypothesis, you experimented, and then you solved the problem, and then everything was good forever, I would. But unfortunately, it really is like a circle. This is less something that we can discreetly solve, the problem of productivity, and more something that we're kind of constantly in the state of adjusting, being aware of, evaluating, making changes. But the goal is to hopefully get to a place where you're making smaller changes more frequently, as opposed to needing to do what you could call just like burning it all down and then starting from scratch. There are times when you have to burn it all down and start from scratch, but ultimately it's easier to build from a place of stability. So one of the questions that I really saw coming up in the chat and the sort of Q&A before this session in the Whova was, how do I know, like, what are my specific questions? What are the things that I need to sort of do in order to be more productive? And the first most important thing that I would say is, what do you mean by productive? How can we get more specific? So some people will come to me and say, I need to be more productive. And they mean I need to be able to write more, or write more efficiently, or write faster, or I need to be able to take this from a rough draft to a polished draft more efficiently than I'm doing right now. That could be what you mean by being more productive. But if by being more productive, you mean I need to be able to carve out more time so that I can get into the deep focus state that I need to be in order to generate new scholarship, then that's a completely different set of problems. It's a completely different set of outcomes. So thinking about and getting as specific as we can, how to define and isolate your variables. What are you working with? What are you testing? What are you measuring? The more specific you can be, the better it works to design your experiment, which I'm sure is of no surprise to any of the scientists or those trained in the scientific method among us. The more specific your hypothesis, the easier to define the test, the easier to tell if it worked, the easier to get the clear, actionable data. So, two sides of the same coin. What you can measure, you can improve. So those of you who know me or know me in other places might know that right now, as is perpetual with me, I'm trying to learn how to run. I'm not a great runner. It's not something that comes naturally to me, but I want to. And so what I am measuring, my specific thing right now, is the pace that I can run during 1 minute sprints. So I have 1 minute sprints, I repeat them, and I'm trying to up that pace. But when I was just saying like, okay, I want to learn to run, and I wasn't tracking it, I wasn't measuring my workouts, I wasn't measuring my heart rate, I was just doing it and hoping that it worked. But the things that you measure are the things that you pay attention to, and then the things that you pay attention to are the things that are easiest to improve, or at least to change. Whether or not that's an improvement or not is something that you kind of mess around with. But it's hard to change things that you're not paying attention to. So if you're coming into your office and you're not tracking your time and you're not looking at your tasks and you're just sort of only dealing with fires, welcome to 2021. That's the way that a lot of us are working. But it's really hard to get data about where your time is going because you're not paying attention to it. So the other thing is that sometimes you have to do something different to feel something different. I wish this wasn't true. I wish that I could just keep watching Grey's Anatomy and then eventually I would become productive. But sometimes I have to change things in order to get new data. But on the flip side, evaluation doesn't need to be self-criticism. And the more that you can disentangle those two, the better. So just because the experiment doesn't work doesn't mean that you stop being a scientist. So right now, I will tell you that in my running experiment, my running pace has not really improved, but I have a lot more data than I did 2 months ago, where I can start to see, okay, if I run more frequently, will that work? If I try and run faster, if I change my shoes, I have more data and it's moving me forward. I'm in a different spot. I know different things than I did when I was starting this process in October. And even though the goal hasn't been accomplished, I'm in a much better place. I'm more empowered. So just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just means that I'm getting more and more specific about the problem that I'm trying to solve. So your mileage may vary with this, but from my understanding from the past 20 months of my work with clients, my own embodied experience, now is a really difficult time to do a whole life makeover, if that makes sense. I sometimes refer to this as like new year energy, that we all are like, okay, on the 1st of January, I'm going to be a whole new person. So thinking about making smaller tweaks, more efficient ones can really help. Building on the things that are really working as opposed to trying to start a million new things at once, because the fewer things that you're manipulating at any one time, the cleaner your data will be. So the data doesn't lie. And this is a really important point, that only you have access to the full data picture. I know that my advisor, when I was a PhD student, didn't know that I had a chronic illness. It was something that I didn't feel safe to disclose. But when she would say like, hey, this month was really terrible for you, I would personally know that it was the highest pain month I'd ever had. And that's why I wasn't writing. But she didn't know that. All she saw was the lack of productivity. So only you have access to the full picture. But at the same time, what works for someone else might not work for you. So if you're trying to get up at 6 a.m. and write every single morning, and consistently you sleep through your alarm, and consistently you fall asleep at your desk, maybe that data is suggesting to you you're not a 6 a.m. writing person. And that's not good or bad. There's nothing magical about 6 a.m. It just means that for whatever reason, it's not working for you right now, and it's best to try something different. So some strategies, I'm going to skip ahead and I can answer questions at the end about working with emotion rather than sort of doing this, but some quick strategies for working as promised. The first that I love is to move away from a running to-do list. I wish that we could check everything off of our to-do list every day. It would be such a great world if we could, but we really can't. So I like to think about to-do lists as something that have 3 different categories. The A category are things that need to get done or else. I will sometimes say this as needs to get done or there will be severe and immediate consequences. So for example, today I had to get the resources page done for this talk before 3 p.m. because it was starting. There would have been severe and immediate consequences. It would be great to, in my B column, get, those emails done or get a head start on something done for Friday. But if I don't get to it, the world's not going to end. And then there are things that at the beginning of the day, I know that I need to get to them. It's just probably not going to happen today. And I will be honest, I often move things from the B column into the C column around lunchtime. I'm very optimistic in the morning about what I can handle and what I can't. And so adjusting it lets me focus on the most important things and also monitor myself. So if I sit down at my desk and I say, okay, it would be great to get these things done and I do them, it's easy for me to see that I'm avoiding the A-list things. And if I'm avoiding them, I can ask myself why and maybe support it. So the ABC list was given to me as a PhD student, and I've done it almost every day since then. Next is to pay attention to zombie tasks. And zombie tasks are things that have shown up on your list. You may not remember them. They may not be relevant anymore, but you're carrying them with you. So for a long time, I really wanted to launch this workshop about thinking traps that people can fall into. And I wrote it down on my to-do list every day for 6 months. And then finally, I just said, okay, this isn't going to happen this month. I'm going to put it to the side. If I want to handle it, I can. End of month and end of term is a really useful time to clear out the things that aren't relevant anymore. Maybe your priorities have shifted. Maybe these things aren't as important. This can also be a really good time if you switch task management systems. I'm constantly bouncing between ClickUp and Notion and Trello. And part of what's useful about that process of transferring is evaluating whether or not these tasks really are what I want to be focusing on. Okay, so the habits, chains, and cues is a technique that I have taken from James Clear, who's written a book called Atomic Habits, which I really, really enjoy. But one of the things that was really difficult about the pandemic for many people is that the cues and the habit chains that we had pre-pandemic really changed. So the example that I like to give is that if you worked out on campus, you might have, like gone to campus, taught your class, had lunch, gone to your office, and then you would go and work out at the workout center. But if you're not going to campus anymore, it's really hard to get to the workout center. You have to build a whole new sequence and setups of things to do it. So thinking about reordering the sequence of events that you use. So maybe instead of working out after teaching, you now have to go for a walk on Mondays and Wednesdays. And you do that on the way to, the library to pick things up. You might just have to redo it. But the cue of when to do things, if the cue is shifted, you may need to rebuild it. And habit chains are the same idea. So if you have a habit that's really stable, like say you're really excellent at brushing your teeth twice a day, and you need to become more excellent at taking your medication. The thinking goes that if you add the new habit into an already stable one, it's easier to remember to do it. So now it's just, instead of saying like, okay, I brush my teeth twice a day, it's I brush my teeth, and then when I brush my teeth, I also take my meds. I found that these can be really, really helpful building these chains and building from the places that's already really working. Okay, time logs are eye-opening, but useful. So evaluation is different than mercilessly torturing yourself. But if you really don't have any idea where your time is going during the day, it can be useful to run a short experiment and see where it's going. So you can do it by hand and just sort of keep notes on a Post-it note. I've done it in a bullet journal before. There's also software and browser extensions that can automate this process a little bit for you or press a button. But 8 or 9 times out of 10, my clients are they think that their time is going to different places than it is. They feel like they check their email quickly in the morning, but actually it takes about 90 minutes. They think that it takes them about a month to write a chapter, but in reality, it takes them 3. So time logs can be sort of brutal. The first time I saw how much time I was spending on Twitter during the day, it did cause me to take a step back. But you can't change what you don't know. So think about time logs. The next framework that I really would love to share is one that I have found a lot of success with, and one that people in my community have really enjoyed, is defining from the start of the day what a good, better, best outcome would be. So instead of saying like, okay, by the end of the day, I want to have this draft done, you instead set 3 different markers. So maybe the best case scenario is that you have the draft done and you send it by 5 o'clock and it's great. And a better case, so one step below that, is that you have a draft and it's a little bit messy and you're going to spend a little bit of time, the next day polishing it before you send it off. And maybe the baseline is I get all but the one part of the draft that's really sticky done, and then I shift that till tomorrow. But if you define in advance what the good, better, best, or you could use words like baseline, challenge, or stretch, if you define them ahead of time, it's a lot easier to actually stop at the end of the day. So best case scenario is just that, best case scenario, but you also can cut yourself some slack if you only make it to good or better. I find that defining the baseline really can help take away some of that anxiety. Okay. So overall, the thing that I want to sort of share is that for so many of us, we have this feeling that we're just never productive enough. It doesn't matter how good the day is. It doesn't matter how much work we get done. There is this idea that we aren't doing enough. And so I like to say that your thought that I'm not doing enough, I'm not productive enough, it's real, it's happening. That's what you think, but it might not be true. And so is your job to be perfectly productive all of the time, or is your job to help yourself monitor? I like to think about this as, rather than my job is to be perfectly productive all of the time, my job is to come back to presence and come back to centering myself. And so sometimes I'm meant to be writing and I find myself on Twitter. It's not my job to fight against the literal legion of engineers who are meant to make Twitter a space that I continually and habitually open. It's not my job to overcome the dopamine hits of Twitter. My job is to notice if I've drifted there and come back to the task at hand, no matter how many times that happens. So, it's also useful to think about the unspoken dependencies. I know that just today, I was like, okay, I am going to go for a run as soon as I'm done with this task. And I didn't say that on my to-do list, but in my head, I was like, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. And I wasn't willing to break it until I got that done. But that led to me not getting my run in on time, rushing a little bit, being a little bit nervous for this. So thinking about in your head, what triggers the thing that makes you stop? What triggers end of day? Is it a time of day, or is it being done with everything on your to-do list? And if your to-do list is an ever-running mountain, then how do you know when you're done for the day? How do you know when it's enough? So thinking about the unspoken rule that we have, like, I will stop working for the year after I finish this chapter, or I'll quit for the day as soon as my email is cleared out. Your email may never be cleared out. So how are you going to keep that boundary? At the end of the day, academia probably will not swoop in and put the brakes on for you. Unless you have a really, truly outstanding mentor, they're not going to swoop in and say, you've done enough. And overall, that's not the culture that we live in. Everybody is trying to hustle. Everybody's trying to grind. So you do have to take a little bit of responsibility for defining for yourself. Okay, what hours am I capable of working? How much rest do I need? How much and what kinds of rest do I need? What is actually possible for me during the day when I also have to keep my kids on track and I also have to do all of this work in my house and it's all the same place? And unfortunately, this is rarely I have a problem, I sought out a solution, and then I solved it forever. I wish that productivity was like that, but it really is something that when your resources shift, your output shifts, and if those things are changing all of the time, you will need to be changing all of the time. And that doesn't mean that you've done it wrong. It just means that that's the world. And so framing that as this is less something that I need to solve once and for all, and more, this is something that I'm going to be continually monitoring, not because I'm a problem, but because that's how it works. But overall, your data is important and it's your first line of information. So if you're feeling consistently exhausted at the end of the day and you're collapsing onto your couch at 7 p.m. on Friday and sleeping until Monday, that's important data about the level of productivity, the level of rest. And if you don't take it seriously, it's hard for somebody else to. So I have put in the chat a link of resources, some books that I have, some other seminars, some other strategies. But next, I would love to take any questions. I tried to leave a little bit of time. So if there's anything, I can stop the screen share and open up the chat box. And I can also look on the Whova chat. I will go through and answer questions as best as I can after the session. But if there's any that I can take live, I would love to hear that. Feel free to throw them in the chat.
Hi, I had a quick question. I just
Sure.
went ahead and unmuted myself. Something I've noticed and listening to you has made me think about a lot is how we're like on Zoom calls, and at the same time, I'm constantly anxious to work at the same, like do something else at the same time because I can, because nobody's looking at me if I'm paying attention or not. And that's
Yes.
just, yeah, I would love if you can comment on that because I'm sure it happens to everybody.
Yeah, it definitely happens to everybody. And I think about that in terms of like mindfulness, actually. And that's the frame that really helps me, is that I know that at my best, I don't multitask well, and very few people do, but there is this expectation that like, oh, I can have this window open and I can do this. And so the framework that I personally use is whatever I'm going to do, I do it on purpose. So if I'm going to be in this meeting, I'm going to try and be in this meeting on purpose. Or if I'm going to answer emails, I'm going to try and be in my emails and focused on that on purpose. Or conversely, if I'm going to be on the couch watching my show, I'm going to try and do that on purpose, as opposed to half doing my email and half resting and not really accomplishing either one. So it is really hard, and it is tempting to multitask, and I've done it and we've all done it. But it's something for me that I try and look at the data and say like, okay, am I actually getting a lot of work done, or is this just increasing my feeling that I'm never doing enough? And that feeling is important. That's valuable data. And if you don't take it seriously, it's hard for other people too. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So try on purpose. And again, it's for me, it's something that I'm continually coming back to, as opposed to something that I'm like nailing from the jump. Okay, is it reasonable to expect people to be productive for the same number of hours, i.e. a normal workday, when primarily remote or in person? Oh, I wish I had a good, I mean, my gut says no. And it definitely depends on who you are and what the job is and what the resources, what it means to be at home for you. I know that a lot of the clients that I've worked with personally, I'm my own boss, and I have found her to be eminently understanding of what it means to be working from home. But if you have your own boss, it does tend to be something that either people are very attached to the metric of hours, but less attached to sort of what gets done during the day. Like I need to clock in, or I need to clock out, or I need to be available over Slack for these hours. Or there's a certain amount of work that needs to get done in a week or a month or sort of a day interval. And as long as I get to that, it doesn't really matter what the hours are. But I find that knowing in which way you're going to primarily be evaluated in terms of whomever is expecting you to work, or so who's ever setting those evaluations, the more clear you can be on the terms of the evaluation, the more you can tailor the way that you're thinking about it to those terms. It's sort of like studying for the test, if that makes sense. Like if you know what you're going to be tested on, you can adjust to that. It's a completely different ballgame. And what I share with clients a lot of times is that most people, and this is like a study that we've done, most people in ideal conditions have about 4 hours of deep focus work in them a day, and that's it. And the rest of it is drifting or admin work or something that's a little bit less intense. But no one I know, I literally have never met a person who is able to do like more than 4 hours consistently, like in a sustainable way over of really deep focused work without burning out at some point. So thinking about what you're expecting, like if you're expecting yourself to sit at your desk and be generating new words for 8 hours a day, 4 days a week, that might not be A, what other people are doing, or B, what your brain is capable of. So I know that for me, I had two-hour writing blocks, and then I was probably working about 8 hours a day, but those other 4 hours were much less intense. I was reading, or I was doing email, or I was, making clips for class, or doing a little bit of grading. But that I definitely didn't have 8 of the same hours for sure. So yeah. I think we have space for like one more quick question if somebody's got one. Otherwise, I will go ahead and answer the Q&As in the chat. There, I've put the resource link there. Everything there is really great. But thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Katie. I have to say, I'm sure that I speak for so many of our participants when I say that the strategies you provided were so effective, they were so realistic, and I just felt waves of relief washing over me personally as I kind of think about, as I think you've articulated so well, these ongoing challenges of productivity. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Oh, there was a quick question that came in. If you could speak more about the end of the day or end of work queue. So the best advice that I have for this, and I will post on the resource blog, I will make a note. I actually wrote something on my blog about it, but I try very hard to end my day on purpose. And that means that I literally do things to end my day. So for me, I try to be done by like 6 or 7. It doesn't always happen. But when I'm done for the day, I close out all of the tabs, which some people think is barbaric, but I do it. Like I close out all of the tabs that I'm not using. I do one last pass of my email. I shut down things. And then I literally shut down my computer because it makes it so much harder for me to then like wake it up and check for an email. And it did take a while for those cues to sort of happen, but the combination of closing tabs, picking up all of my beverage things, because I'm a multi-beverage person, taking them to the dish and then turning the computer off has really, really helped. But I think thinking about it as this is something that sets me up for tomorrow and it's part of the work can really help. And then it's like getting to pack up early, 15 minutes before the bell. So, all right. Thank you so much. And I have a great rest of the conference, everybody.